there's been a lot of moral talk that's been around, but no real grounding of what it's about. And I think in the century or 2 centuries prior to Augustine, you start to have this more popularity come to the forefront of the academic skeptics who just believe that no truth can be found about anything, or they constantly evade and try to do their best, sort of three-card Monte approach to coming to the truth. And so here, Augustine is taking these different approaches and trying to read them in a hierarchical fashion. And so what you see is not merely, well, these guys are right a little bit and these guys are right a little bit or something, and then, let's come to a middle ground. Instead, he rightly orders them. And he says, first, we have to begin with the neo-academic thing of seeking. And we have to realize that seeking has to result in finding.
Throughout life, we meet others who have insights and experiences quite unlike our own. The great ideas of classical works resonate differently with them. Often these treasures of mind and heart go unshared, reserved from others in the course of daily life. But what if we took the time to have those conversations, to sit down and recall those thoughts, those impressions upon us that moved us along our path? Why then, we would no longer be alone, and at least for one shimmering moment, someone else could see the world through our eyes. I give you the Confederal Reserve. Welcome to the Confederal Reserve, presented by BetterPears. I am your host, Dr. Jason Fugikawa. The Confederal Reserve is a show that connects old friends, that is, Confederates, to discuss the ideas and classical works that have shaped their lives and worldviews. Before we get going, I invite you to like this episode, subscribe to the BetterPears channel, and click the icon to receive notifications so that you remain the first to know of future interviews and podcast episodes. Now then, the structure of the show is our gimmick we want you to mimic. Our guest for the episode will offer a classical work of particular import to his or her life. What ensues is a conversation that uncovers insights and offers new perspectives on old works. It is a conversation between friends, which is the building block of the cultural renaissance that BetterPears seeks to foster. Our guest today is Dr. Christopher Collins, professor of theology at the University of Mary in Bismarck, North Dakota. His research focuses on the thoughts of those foundational early church fathers, such as St. Augustine and St. Gregory the Great. He believes that the answers provided by these luminaries of the faith of the church respond to the perennial questions of philosophy, theology, and what it means to live happily. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest today to the Confederal Reserve, Dr. Christopher Collins. Christopher, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Really, again, the gimmick we want you to mimic. The question is, so what vintage work have you brought for us today, and why is it so important?
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me here, Jason. So, as you read in your intro, the things that I'm concerned about, ancient church fathers and how it helps illuminate or direct us to what happiness looks like, the work I've chosen is On the Happy Life by St. Augustine. It seems
very good,
fairly apt for our conversation.
Yeah. So On the Happy Life. So maybe a lot of our audience would understand, say, like Augustine's Confessions or the City of God, maybe the soliloquies or other kinds of things. Where does On the Happy Life fit in?
Yes. So On the Happy Life is Augustine's first completed work, actually. It's a small dialogue. It was written during the winter of 386, before he was received into the church at Easter in 387 in Milan. So he and his friends go to this nice sort of vintage vacation, for a long period of time here in the winter of 386. And Augustine decides that what he's going to do with this vacation between jobs, as he's left his speech writing gig for the emperor, is he's going to refound philosophy. So
no simple task at your Verbo, right? Yeah.
Exactly. That's basically what he does, and he writes a series of works that are called the Cassiciacum dialogues. So there are four pieces, of which the soliloquies is the last one. And so the first one is the Contra Academicos, the response to academic skeptics, which is about epistemology, right? Then he comes to this work On the Happy Life, which he starts second but finishes first, which is a response, to.
I know that process. The thing.
Right.
The
So
thing
this
just kind
is
of takes off. Yeah.
his refounding of ethics, or resituating of ethics, we might want to say. And then his third
Okay.
one is De Ordine, where he resituates metaphysics. Right. So those are generally the three topics he's considering.
Yeah, De Ordine would be probably the last one I would finish. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Right. Right. Normally that one's translated as on providence, but I mean that's an interesting translation. On measure would even seem better. On order,
It seems like you could have order without providence,
right?
but yeah, in an abstract sort of philosophical sense, but not necessarily in a creator sense. But okay, no,
Right.
I'll grant you that. So on the Happy Life, or de Beata Vita,
Right.
I'll let you know that currently on the BetterPears podcast, the other show from BetterPears, I'm working on the episode on beatitude.
Mm.
So I'm coming with thoughts that are stirring right
Mm.
now on blessedness or beatitude and what that might mean.
Right.
But I'm willing to hear out Augustine and your interpretation of Augustine here.
Yeah. Well, great. Yeah. So we don't get quite to beatitude in this text. We get to
Sure.
a contemplative dimension of God, but as Augustine is resituating things, as he's trying to take and call the good fruits that have come from pagan Rome, but also say how philosophy is totally broken. At the same time, he's having to do this is a dialogue that is trying to lay groundwork, and so it's not a very polished piece in lots of ways. It certainly isn't a great or fabulous work in terms of its execution. But in what Augustine is bringing to the foreground as his project, I think this is why it jumps out to me as being such a wonderful piece.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about its execution, then we'll talk about kind of that foundation. How is it executed? Like it is it just a treatise, or is I think some of them, like, well, the soliloquies is kind of a conversation with oneself. Is this a dialogue kind of like the against the academicians, the skeptics?
Yes, so it's formulated a bit like those other dialogues rather than the soliloquies, right, where Augustine is simply talking to his own reason or his own soul. This is Augustine is sitting around speaking with 7 other characters, and so it's much more like Plato's Symposium, perhaps, than in its sort of original formulation than other works. So there's a number of characters; they're each offering their own opinions. Um, what I like is that Augustine is clearly the leader of these conversations and prompting them and reformulating, giving a great model of what an educator is supposed to be, prompting people, prodding them, moving them to the truth. But then Monica swoops in and gives the right answers, like time after time again. Even though she doesn't, have the philosophical training that these other guys do. So Augustine and his other, his brother and his son, and then a bunch of 30-year-olds who are hanging around, just sort of not doing much of anything. And then Monica, who's making meals for them, and walks in, provides the right answer, and then exits stage left again. It's pretty humorous.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Monica gets her payback in the confessions, right? It's just sort of like, why are you bringing these things up about your mom and her kind of dipsomania as a young woman, or the weird, like, superstitious acts that she was doing that,
sacrificing to the pagan gods, or at least like continuing the North African, the Punic traditions, pouring out libations, basically.
Right.
Even in the church.
So,
and Ambrose has to correct her, and we don't do that here.
Yeah, so this, at least in this work on the Happy Life,
right.
she's kind of like, okay,
yes,
good job, Mom.
And like in the Symposium, she functions almost like a Diotima type figure, right? She's the one who comes in, provides all the right answers. She is the embodiment of faith. And so here we have Augustine with his friends raising philosophic problems, but then how the Christian faith comes in and provides the right answers, right? The uneducated Christian faith is the one that rightly situates or rightly confirms and orders the philosophic trajectory that has been in place.
I see. So it makes sense that it wouldn't be like a character, right, or a personification, or just the person of someone like Ambrose, or like, because he had his stuff together, right, and
Right.
then he becomes a Christian. Like,
Right.
oh
And so this
no,
needs to be a
obviously,
character because part of the subtext of this is the dialogue between faith and reason. And so, because Monica can serve in that role as the uneducated, right, who doesn't impress, right, as a woman, at this time where you don't expect a woman
right.
to be involved in a dialogue. Um,
I don't remember women showing up in Plato
yeah,
ever.
yeah, I think Diotima might be it,
Yeah,
right? Um,
yeah.
so,
So so they can. We talked about kind of the structure and the form or whatever, but the founding, or you said it was sort of a refounding of philosophy or
right,
moral philosophy.
right.
So why did it need a refounding? And then, okay, what is this refounding, or how would you sum it up?
Yeah, so certainly before this time period, we have a number of schools of thought that, as a good Neoplatonist, Augustine wants a unified sort of theory of everything. And so he wants to bring these together. And unfortunately, between the different iterations of the Greek schools and the Roman tendency to just focus on ethics no matter what, um, there's been a lot of moral talk that's been around, but no real grounding of what it's about. And I think in the century or 2 centuries prior to Augustine, you start to have this more popularity come to the forefront of the academic skeptics who just believe that no truth can be found about anything, or they constantly evade and try to do their best sort of three-card Monte approach to coming to the truth. And so here, Augustine is taking these different approaches and trying to read them in a hierarchical fashion. And so what you see is not merely, well, these guys are right a little bit and these guys are right a little bit or something, and then, let's come to a middle ground. Instead, he rightly orders them and he says, first, we have to begin with the neo academic thing of seeking. And we have to realize that seeking has to result in finding. And what is that finding? So that moves us from the academic skeptic to the Ciceronian, or to this, Cicero's a weird figure here, but the Stoic conclusion about virtue. But then,
Right.
then the,
So along that lines, though, like, and I think maybe one way to frame it then, like this idea of seeking or desiring, right? There's sort of a movement in morality, which will again eventually get us to sort of like a teleological kind of framework for morality, right?
right,
Like maybe for our listeners, something like the Ten Commandments seem to be a moral law, because they are, uh, but there's no uh, kind of, okay, and we're doing this because, right,
right,
love the Lord your God, okay, but how does that get me to my kind of eternal reward,
that's right,
right? And that's something that's developed in sort of the divine pedagogy over the centuries,
right,
and perfected in the revelation of Jesus Christ, where there is a kind of a road map and a kind of articulation of what our end state is in
hmm
beatitude,
right,
which this work does not get to apparently, uh, and yet kind of that movement from simply do these things because they are good, and don't do these things because they are evil,
yeah,
to do these things because they lead to a teleological, a final state good for you,
that's right,
is an important kind of shift. Okay, I'll
absolutely.
let you continue.
No, so he starts out book two, or sorry, day two of the conversation. It's a 3-day conversation. And day two starts out exactly on that point where he goes, well, what does it mean to be happy? Does it mean doing what God wants? That's option one, right? A divine command theory, right? Just follow the 10 Commandments and that's it, right? Sort of option.
Right.
And then there's a discussion. Well, option two, he who does well and lives well, i.e., eudaimonia, a vision of virtue. And then the third option he gives is, well, what about a lack of an unclean spirit? And that, of course, is a weird sort of turn where we have to like unpack that. And he spends some time unpacking what he means there. But the conclusion he's pointing to is that it's actually all of these things. Happiness has to be all of these. And how do we get there is by a stepwise ascent, right? That we go from the skeptic position to the Stoic, and we go from the Stoic position to the Neoplatonic, because the Neoplatonists, what they bring in are metaphysics. They give the right orientation and understanding of the soul, where the Stoics have, I mean, they're super wise and virtuous guys, but they don't lack the there behind nature, right? That they put up as a simple thing to follow always. And so Augustine's saying, like, we got to break through that to see what's really going on in the soul. And so it's this stepwise ascent that ultimately, once we get to the Neoplatonic step, we go, well, now what? And then Monica sort of swoops in with the answer, right? This is where we now come to Christianity, where God has to provide the final, like, it's not just enough to be concerned about the soul, or virtue or knowledge, like, but it's all of them together.
So two things there, right? One, kind of the introduction of a kind of a stepwise approach, because I think there is, I don't know if it's just a human tendency. Apparently it's like the Sith that deal in absolutes. Apparently, Obi-Wan taught me that. Like is that tendency, just kind of the all or nothing, right? Like, well, if I just have the right ideas, it seems to be kind of the ancient way of understanding the problem of sin, right? It's just sort of like they didn't know the right, they didn't know the truth, and so they didn't know the good, and so they chose lesser goods, right? But that knowledge, or something, can be this kind of X factor that can change wrong living into right living,
Right.
and that it happens kind of in a polar way, just sort of all at once.
Right.
Uh, and so he's suggesting, okay, no, that's not how we experience life.
Right.
that we have incremental changes. And I think the beauty of Augustine, and the way I think that Saint Augustine is sort of the antidote for our age in the Chestertonian sense, right? Is that he was dealing with a society of the Roman Empire in decline. And so whereas in like the High Middle Ages, you'll have the systematic theology of the schoolmen, and who are kind of, able to kind of just tell you that you kind of reap or harvest the fruits of the fathers, and give you kind of like the answer. Augustine's work, I'm thinking primarily like of his work on the Trinity, where it is this I'm going to throw this out there, and then the next book, oh yep, there was a problem with that, and then here's another idea, what is the Trinity, right? And then here's a different appropriation to it, and it is a stepwise kind of thing, right? If you've read the Confessions, like his hang up over whether God is a body, right? The sponge that can absorb the whole ocean, and like, but then there would still be a limit to his form, and he can't quite get over that. And once he does, then he enters into a new kind of level of understanding of the divine, and this little by little, right? He gets to a spot where his intellectual conversion, his moral conversion, and his spiritual conversion all kind of coincide.
Right.
But coincide, but then also kind of in disjointed ways, right? Grant me chastity, but not yet. Like, I know I want it, but I don't want it. Or, it's not that I hate my sins, it's that I love my sins. That's the problem. So I think that's the other aspect you were talking about there.
Right.
That it's the kind of the unity of life, opposed to just the intellect. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, because it is a difficulty. I don't know if necessarily I was prepared as a young person growing up to realize that adult life has all these aspects all at once, right? This sort of as rebellious as teenagers can be, and I was not a very rebellious teenager, as rebellious as teenagers can be, right? The conformity that their betters are presenting to them is sort of allowing them to focus on certain aspects of their life at given times, right? The whole idea of a school where you're thinking, right? Or if a university setting where a cafeteria is like making your food and handling kind of the nutritive aspect of your existence, so that you can focus on the intellectual formation of yourself, allows you to kind of isolate things. But real perfection is all the different aspects of life.
Right.
So the conversation is becoming much more daunting as we go on in this. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, man, so many good sort of jumping off points from that. That's great. So one of the things that my students normally really dislike in moral theology class is I have them read Gregory of Nyssa.
It's a list. They formalize the list. Yeah.
This is Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses. And in that work, he describes virtue as, or he defines it as, that which is without limits. A number of students.
No, but virtue is the mean between extremes. Yes. There's obviously limits.
Right. Right. There may be horizontal limits, but not vertical limits. Right.
Okay.
You're only going deeper, further and further into the Lord. It's very Reepicheep-esque. Right. For Gregory of Nyssa.
The Don Treader reference. Good.
Yeah. And so it's just more and more like God. Augustine senses that, that balance between cataphatism and apophaticism, and right, and how do we make sense of that? We can describe a thing, but then in describing it, we limit it, right, and then we put it on a shelf rather than engaging with it as a mystery. And I think Augustine gets that very well, even in this early stage text. You talked about De Trinitate. We're going to see that in spades, where it's constantly throwing out something and then going deeper. Like we're engaging the mystery more and more. And so the more we define it, the more the mystery opens up to us. The more we get a share in God's like light that bathes us in all that we see. Here we get a glimpse of that light. And where we get it in day 2, there's a discussion of chastity. Right, where Augustine's son, Adeodatus, sort of argues that, well, it's true chastity that leads to happiness, which is an interesting sort of claim, but okay. But then there's a discussion of what does this mean, right? And here I think I would have translated it a little differently than perhaps Michael Foley did. I think Augustine will later reframe this from chastity to temperance more broadly, and I think that's a better frame for it. But it becomes
why so? What do you see as the difference between chastity and temperance? There is no BetterPears podcast on chastity or temperance yet, so
yeah. So chastity is just
research.
We tend to think about chastity in terms of sexual desire only, whereas temperance is about any sort of passionate desire that we have, and so temperance is simply a broader, right? It might also deal with desires for sitting on the couch, or that no one would describe that as chaste. Right.
Yeah. No, one way I kind of describe chastity or temperance is largely like the virtue of kind of moderating the concupiscible passions, whereas courage is the irascible, right? Because courage are things that bring anger to me, and how do I appropriately respond between excess and defect between there, but good things that are pleasing, that appear pleasing at least, right? Regardless of whether they are morally the right thing to do, but they seem to the senses that way. And the temperance is like, how do I appropriately deal with that emotion, that passion,
right,
in the moral life?
Okay. Exactly. And so here in this text, what we see is a very Platonic turn where Augustine prods his son and gets him to consider chastity, but I think more appropriately temperance, as either a specific virtue, i.e. dealing with specific matter about desires that we have, or as a generic virtue. And in this generic virtue, this is what his son gets to, and he defines temperance as, or chastity as, paying attention to God and to him alone, which is a very different definition of temperance or chastity or any of this sort of thing, where Augustine understands the regulation of the passions is only a secondary effect of temperance. It isn't the primary object of temperance, right? And I think that's what causes St. Thomas to misunderstand Augustine on this point, right? Where he famously just says, Augustine puts temperance as the highest virtue because sometimes we put the highest which we struggle with the most.
Ouch. That is the like 8-9 centuries later.
Yeah.
Just trolling. Okay.
Right. Right. But I think he misunderstands what Augustine is doing with temperance. The temperance is about order. and we see that in the rest of the text, that it's about recognizing the order that God has put in the world, that it's this metaphysical, ethical connection. And temperance serves as the transition point between why just doing virtue isn't enough, right? Why just being a nice person isn't good enough? Why fulfilling moral norms it's not sufficient? Because we need to get into the discussion of being. We need to get into the discussion of conformity to the divine mind.
I see. And that would make sense. And maybe that's, I mean, we already broke the C.S. Lewis seal with Reaper Cheap, but I think a large portion of his work on the Great Divorce, right, is that I have in mind. So Great Divorce, right, this sort of allegory of sort of the final judgment and heaven and hell, and it's C.S. Lewis, so it's, you know, allegories limp. You know, Father Christmas does not show up, but whatever. But this sort of idea of this sort of mother who has died, and she's so attached to her son. I don't know if she's an Italian mother or an Irish mother. Anyway, but she's a mother, and she's very attached to her son. And that love for her son, a filial love, which is a good thing, is keeping her, right, from the love of God. And so I think in the Schoolman and perhaps here in Augustine as well, right, you get this understanding of what is our final state, what is our telos, right? In the non-smoking section of our telos, opposed to the smoking section, is the enjoyment of God, right? For the Dominicans, it's the full knowledge of God, or his continual knowing, right? For the Franciscans, it's the love that's primary. It's always confusing inter order battle between the knowing and loving of God. But I think that's kind of a hard pill to swallow. For us to think that eternity, our eternal existence in heaven, right, our participation in the eternity of God and his divine life, is always to be turned to him, and that our knowledge of the rest of creation comes through his revelation to us.
Yes,
but it isn't that there's a communion as sort of like the spokes reach the center of the wheel.
Right.
There is the communion of heaven is not a, hey, let's enjoy, let's go kind of visit with everybody else as individual existences separate from God, but know that they're all kind of understood through God.
Right.
Like I don't know what it is in us that fears that, or that is sort of repugnant to it. But on the one hand, and maybe current political climates, we would say that, oh, well, the centralized knowledge of all existence in one being or one entity or the state, no, I want to have my privacy in heaven. And it's like, I don't think you're quite getting this idea of heaven, right?
Right.
And so maybe I think that's Augustine's trajectory here, right?
Yes. So we can see that absolutely in his commentary on the literal interpretation of Genesis, right? Where this is how he reads the days of creation, that the angels who are created in day one, the light before there's the sun and the moon, the angels who are created have both evening knowledge and then morning knowledge. They see the things in the mind of God that he is going to make, and then they see them being made, right? When you talk about God here as a center of the spoke to which we all turn, I mean, ultimately, I would think we dislike this even our meager participated, creaturely limited vision of this, because we dislike limits so much. The idea that we have to see through him means that we have to recognize our dependency as utter and total. There is no other. There is no other option. All our agency is from him and through him and in him.
Yeah, it's sort of a FOMO, right? The fear of missing out meets the greatest good.
Right.
And you're like,
right.
Does what keeps me in purgatory my desire to see the latest show on Netflix?
Right.
Is there some spectacle that is more shiny than the goodness of God, the truth of God?
But this isn't a fallen world problem, right? It's a creaturely limited problem. But this is Adam and Eve. The last command God gives to them is a limit. So part of the goodness of Eden is to have limits that we didn't recognize very well.
Wait. Okay, what limit are you talking about there? Are you talking about the
commandments
commandments before the fall?
Yeah, of eating of the tree, right? That You
Oh,
know,
okay.
you get Genesis 1 account, it's all be fruitful and multiply, it's go out and have dominion, it's easy, right? Oh, you imagine Adam and Eve being like, all right, we can do all these things. It's great. It's all just good stuff we get to do. But then they're like, wait, in Genesis 2, there's a limit. What do you mean you're putting a boundary on what we can do? Oh, that's not what we signed up for. Um, right? But that's part of the goodness is that we need limits. Yeah.
Ah, and while those limits in this life seem to be around other parts of creation,
Right.
is what Augustine's getting at here in the happy life. That I don't know how to answer that. Is there a limit in beatitude? Is there a limit in this
Yeah.
kind of I don't say reckless or heedless pursuit of God?
Well, so he thinks in this work that, you know, his discussion of happiness is ultimately to have God, but also to be possessed by God. And he concludes this work by talking about, well, what does that actually look like? What does that mean? And that he gets into a discussion of measure and fullness. And he's going to speak more about this in the De Ordine. He carries over that conversation. But it's a matter that we in our the pursuit of wisdom, the fullness of our mind, is a mind conformed totally to the Lord. That the kind of
Hmm.
happiness we get is to be a measured measure, right? That we're the cup that's coming off the stamping press at the factory, right? Which is the real cup? Well, the ultimate cup is in the mind of God, or is God, right? Because, well, complicated stuff, right? But that's the
Yes, yes.
ultimate cup. Um,
Unity of the divine essence.
right.
Okay, yeah.
And then we get a participated version of that, but we get our own minds and souls stamped with his presence if we allow him to communicate to us.
Hmm. I yeah no I part of me is I have a human tension in that kind of the truth of the Matthew Kelly rim shot, the best version of yourself kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, the best version of yourself exists in the mind of God,
Mm-hmm.
and yet in reality, right, you are the current version of yourself,
Right.
but that He has a best version of yourself
Right.
that He's known eternally, that you are invited to become.
Right. And so this gets to the thing you brought up a couple of minutes ago with this great conversational point where we talked about Gregory of Nyssa and this like process of ever unfolding, ever deepening, right? That yes, there is this participated quality that Augustine has to lay down first, but participation is only one side of it. It's a static arrangement. I am a participated being who has my being from the Lord, right? And it's hierarchically arranged, and I'm a higher being than plants and all sorts of things. But not only do we have this static analogy of being from the Neoplatonist, but we have the dynamism of Christian hope coming in and allowing the steps to be transcended, such that while my mind doesn't change to all of a sudden becoming an angelic mind, through the infused graces that God gives us, He can elevate us not in what we are, but how we are what we are, so that we make it, contemplate and praise Him, and in doing so, become transformed more and more.
Yeah. No, I think that might make sense to younger listeners. As I get older,
Mm-hmm.
I am more concerned with like how much glucose my brain is burning when I have to think kind of deeply about things.
Yeah.
And so this idea, right, that our human intellects, while now connected to the limitations of the body, because I read Augustine, I would read Virgil or whatever, you get tired, you have to go to
Mm-hmm.
sleep, right? That kind of happens. Uh, but this idea unlimited in the next life,
Mm-hmm.
both as separated into souls in beatitude, but then ultimately with the resurrection, right? That our knowledge of God would not be limited by the need for sleep,
Right.
right? that those kind of limitations, it's difficult for us to kind of postulate with that as you're younger, like in college days, and you're just sort of like, I could stay up all night. Oh my goodness, I did it all nighter. I'm wonderful. I can still think. Oh my goodness, I can't think. Right? Like it's not quite as apparent to you as someone now in his early 40s, right? Like it is a different um, experience that we can kind of extrapolate from, right? When I'm at my best, when I'm feeling, or when I'm intentionally, not so much the feeling, but the intentionality of my intellect in seeking to know God, when I'm reading the Bible, when I'm reading the Fathers, when I'm trying to kind of understand what God is trying to communicate to me through others, through the written word, through inspired scripture, that that is a particular moment in my Christian walk.
Mm.
but becomes in a way kind of like the seed for the possibility of that, of the veil being lifted, right?
Mm.
Of just seeing God face to face, and that's what I need to kind of, and I think what Augustine's getting at too, is what we need to kind of anchor our moral life on. Is that an assessment
Yeah,
that conforms to what Augustine's getting at?
yeah, I think that there's a tie-in or a link. Augustine is a profoundly curious person, right? Um, you can see this in almost any work you pick up of his, where he's just constantly prodding and trying and look over here, now look over here, now look over, right? It's all over the place, which is amazingly frustrating uh, sometimes, right? It's wonderful, but it's also frustrating. But in a way, his mind sort of works a bit like there's a prayer work by, I think it's like Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, a Carmelite, who's like on the practicing the presence of God as a kind of devotional activity. I think Augustine does that intellectually. Like it's not a devotional like let's render my heart in such a way that I can sort of recall that I'm in the presence of God. I think Augustine just tries to cultivate this constant wonder, right? He is
Mm.
amazed and delighted by the world that he interacts with, even in the inner self, as we see in Confessions, as he takes off book 10 and 11, get a little tedious after a while, right? What is this chasm of memory, right? But it's only because he's got this profound, like, what is this to be human? This is crazy. And so I would say to your questions of being daunted by our finitude, of physical finitude, um, I think the helpful remedy, right, that we could push towards is to be less daunted by our imaginative finitude, right? That we
Mm.
need to fall back in love with the Lord, to fall in love with creation, to fall in love, to be re-enchanted in a way, and to be profoundly curious in asking these questions, in seeing the world as the Lord is revealing each thing to me that I encounter this day.
No, and I think that says it very well. I think kind of the work of Better Pairs and looking at old things is to kind of see the renewing aspect of what is real and therefore sort of constant in the human experience, and then drawing from those reflections of those who came before us, particularly Saint Augustine is sort of the inspiration, or the whole idea of Better Pairs, right, is a reference to book 2 of the Confessions, of him stealing the pears from his neighbor and realizing that there were better pears at home, probably better friends, that he wouldn't have done it, right,
Mm.
if he was in the right company, and and really, right, what is the fruit that was gathered, but sort of a wretchedness of his soul from
Right.
these lesser pears. So this idea of realism, of awe, of the natural world, and particularly in the use of language and how we think about things as sort of a limit to the imagination. I
Mm.
think a lot of the ways that we use language, not just English, but all of our language, all of
Mm.
the kind of word, ready-made word meanings that we carry about with us and employ in our conversations, that there's sort of a deeper kind of reality to them.
Mhm.
And so kind of conversations like this allow us to kind of dig into that. The other aspects of Better Pairs allow us to dig into that. And so it's very uh, grateful for your appearance today here on the program. At this time, uh, again, thanking you for your insights on St. Augustine's On the Happy Life. I want to give you some time to share your current projects with our audience and let them know how they can follow your work.
Yeah, thanks so much. I teach at the University of Mary. We're a Benedictine institution, so I've gotten to spend a good number of years now teaching a course on Saint Benedict. And so one of the things that I've discovered, my current project that I'm working on right now is doing a translation of Gregory the Great's Life of Benedict, book 2 of his dialogues, which corresponds to book 2 of Augustine's Cassiciacum dialogues as part of my thesis, and showing how Gregory responds by giving us the life of a saint as the incarnated response. It's not enough to have a theoretical sort of integration of faith and reason, but we actually have to have it concretely realized in the life of a person. And so I'm focused on that work right now, writing a translation of that small work and then a commentary on it as well that explores the layers of meaning that St. Gregory is trying to invest in this in a way that's mostly crazy, I've determined, but I think it's an amazing work. And so that's what I'm working on right now, hopefully to be published sometime this fall. And then, I'm giving a conference here at Kalamazoo before long on Gregory's sacramentality in this work, how there's different elements of the sacramental system, as well as sort of his broader sacramental vision, how physical and spiritual things are constantly interworking in a really charming and very, a way that we would be uncomfortable with, I think, sort of way.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah.
So two things on that. The life of Saint Benedict. I've taught that at the high school level before, and it's definitely a work where you think I'm not getting all of this here. There's something there's interesting parallels and structures that it is difficult to kind of dive into. So thank you for your work on diving into connecting it to not only the historical context of the church and any understanding of the sacramental life and the life of faith, but then also I think the corollaries you're finding with the work of Saint Augustine is going to be very fruitful. For the second thing is that Kalamazoo. You say Kalamazoo, it's not just like you just hang out in the city. What exactly is the event at Kalamazoo for those who are unfamiliar with the?
Yeah, I've never been there before, so I might. I'm sure it's a lovely place. So no, this is the International Medieval Congress that takes place there every spring. I'm going to be speaking this year here at the beginning of May, middle of May, here at their big medieval confab. And so I'll be talking briefly, 45 minutes here, about what Gregory is trying to do here in this text. So hopefully it'll be a fruitful sort of, given that I've worked on this commentary, it's a way for me to push that a little bit further, or what are his claims, or repackage and reformulate my thoughts a little bit, in a way that is in a more presentable way than a couple 100-page book.
Sure. No, wonderful. So yes, thank you again, Chris, from all of us here at the Confederal Reserve and the BetterPears Cultural Empire. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the Confederal Reserve.